Hello and welcome to IEEE Soft Robotics podcast. In this podcast, we're going to interview researchers from both academia and industry about their work, thoughts, spectrum, and more beyond that. This is Marwa Edwini, and I hope you will find this podcast useful. If you would like to connect with us, simply send us, and we will be happy to hear from you. And here is my interview. Thanks.
So I'd like to ask you first how you'd like to define who you are for the audience, maybe first time listening to you.
Yeah, so my name is Auke Ijspeert. I'm a professor at EPFL in Lausanne, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And I'm leading the biorobotics laboratory. So we are doing robotics in between biology and robotics. And maybe just to present myself a bit more, I was trained, in fact, as a physicist at EPFL. I did my PhD in Edinburgh in Scotland in AI and spent some time at USC as a postdoc doing robotics. And I came back almost 20 years ago, so it's almost a 20-year anniversary at EPFL as a professor.
So since you work in the scope of robotics and also there's other domain, but I'm curious to ask you what maybe still now in robotics you think it is harder challenges, not really addressed or touch it deeply, the harder challenge in the field.
Yeah, as a field, as a whole, I think the main challenge that robotics has these days is, first of all, the interaction with humans. So how to come closer to humans, possibly even wearable robotics, really having physical interaction with humans. I think that's a big challenge. The second big challenge, I think, which is still not properly solved, is good outdoors locomotion, field robotics, having robots that, like animals, can swim, run, climb mountains, jump. I think we making very good progress, but that's still, I think, where animals are still outperforming almost any robots these days.
So yeah, I'm curious to ask you in that case because in inspiration, I'm curious what's maybe lacking in understanding when evolution put these things together, the locomotion, and when you try to look to that, what may be missing pieces or understanding so that we can replicate or come up with new design when you looked at that process?
Yeah, I think there are multiple challenges of to approach the animal skills or human skills in locomotion. Some are just mechanical, so more very sturdy robots that have enough degrees of freedom, enough compliance, enough torque output to do the things that animals can do. And also, especially if you want to go in water or be in what's called multimodal locomotion, switching between modes of locomotion. Then on top of that, you have to be waterproof, dustproof, impact resistant. So mechanical challenges are really still there. And then, interestingly, there's a perception challenge, I think. Animals are amazing with this multimodal sensory input, so vision, balance, tactile, proprioception. Especially interesting, the skin and the tactile aspects are still quite weak in robots. I think vision-wise we're doing very good, but very well. But tactile aspects and proprioception are still a bit difficult. And then, of course, the control aspects and the planning. How to do both very reactive control, be very reactive like reflexes that animals have, and at the same time how to do some anticipation and planning. In a dynamic environment and some kind of reasoning, also kind of just normal reasoning, what's good to do or not bad to do. I think these are all challenges also there, kind of a bit the AI and control aspects are also challenging.
And we look to this, what you mentioned, what may be more significant or maybe we need to push more back in this direction. You think it's very significant for robot design? At least we can, have intelligence.
Yeah, I think it's a must. Let's say if we want to really have useful robots outdoors, I think some of these aspects for indoor robotics are maybe less important, especially in the mechanical aspects. But to really be useful outdoors, have a robot that has enough operation hours before braking and that doesn't get stuck every 5 minutes and everything. And basically be useful. I think we really need to push all these boundaries much more to really have good useful tools for stakeholders and end users.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to maybe the challenges through your lab, for example, what could be something still maybe hard to understand or so challenging? You mentioned many things, but one aspect is very challenging, do you think, or you don't understand how we can get over this problem.
Yeah, maybe a very concrete example, which is a bit a hot topic in my lab these days, and I'm happy if people listen and may have ideas of how to do it, is how to create a whole body tactile skin that's waterproof and that can give that can be kind of put around our salamander or snake-like robots or quadruped robots, and that can provide interaction forces, both the normal forces, the shear forces, the tangential forces, and also the location of these on the body, because I think that's also what beautiful is animals is they can do multi-body contacts everywhere, so they can crawl around, they know where they're touching the environment. I think we now have wonderful examples of quadruped robots, but they are good at sensing forces on the feet, but not good at sensing forces elsewhere. And that is very important. If you're stuck, you need to know where are the contacts all over the body, how to use this contact to move forward. Especially if you want to be amphibious, maybe we can come back to that later, but that's a very cool topic. How can you swim, push against water, push against mud? How can you do switching of modes of locomotion? And there, a big challenge we have is how to sense these interaction forces.
If there is a trade-off here, if you can say that there is a trade-off between these two environments, you can't really avoid in that case, or what's the actual problem here?
Yeah, there's a trade-off. You're absolutely right. There's a trade-off between terrestrial forces and water forces. So there's a very specific challenge in the water is that the forces are fairly small as opposed to a contact force on ground, but they are very much distributed. So you need to measure ideally pressure and flow of water all over the body, and these forces are small scale. So we develop sensors that can have like little force sensors that can measure the pressure on the whole segment, but we don't know exactly how we don't have a good spatial resolution. So we can measure these forces, but only on a big surface. And then these sensors are too fragile if you go to impacts and collisions. So these sensors, the range is too small to measure high forces you have when you do crawling or impacts with the ground. So they are not suited for terrestrial applications. Yeah, so finding this trade-off of being spatially good, big range of measurement forces between high Newton numbers and small, that's still not there, as far as I know. So if anyone has something, please write to me. We should collaborate.
So I'm curious to ask you that in that case about the design of the robots, for example, what kind of maybe is more important you have to start with in design process? I think modeling, maybe you can tell us modeling may be challenging in that case to replicate what you want to do. And in which basis do you go? You have to go exactly the same as animal, or just you have to get some parts, or completely have to change how the process of the design? I'm curious about that part, how you go for that part.
Yeah. So that really depends on what are the goals of your project. And I would say the field of biorobotics has typically two main goals. One which is to solve a problem, so an engineering goal. Make a good robot that can, swim and do an inspection of pipes. And therefore, you should just take inspiration of the good things of biology and not of the bad things. I mean, biology is not perfect. Evolution is messy. So the only some key aspect that you then want to replicate. So that's if you have an engineering goal. Another big aspect of biorobotics, which I like personally a lot, is the scientific goal of using a robot as a scientific tool to understand animal locomotion. And there's a very interesting question of what's the right model, physical model. Your robot doesn't need to replicate exactly all the properties of animals, but just at the right level of abstraction, depending on the question, you should match some key properties. And the design process for both, let's say, these engineering goals or the scientific goals are a bit different, because indeed, in one case, you have to be sturdy and solve a specific problem. In the other case, it really depends on the question. If the question is high level, like some of our robots are really what I would call first order approximation of the body, just like a snake-like body. We don't go further than that, but we can already answer scientific questions with this first approximation. So that influences a bit. I would say it's always important to know what's the goal and then only design the right robot. And of course, use simulation a lot. We use extensively simulation before developing robots. Otherwise, you waste time making hardware which might not be useful.
That's a good point. So I'm curious to ask you that case. I think we speak about embodied intelligence, and when it comes to design of the robots being, the body and the brain side, do you think the body itself, you mentioned snake, etc., you have to go from this rigid structure, for example, to soft? There's two versions of that maybe. So I'm curious about your way of thinking about the body and the relationship here about the body design and the brain. And you should manifest intelligence through the body in that case, or how do you see this relationship or the interplay here between the brain side and the body side?
Yeah, I think that's really a big lesson from biology and from biomechanics in particular. Is it's really worth making the body right. So have the right compliance at the right level, the right damping at the right level, the right degrees of freedom. So all this field of embodiment and soft robotics or merging hard and soft. Personally, I think we should also have hard components. We have bones for good reasons. But that's indeed super important. And as we well know, a problem that seems very complex from a control point of view or perception can be simplified a lot if you have the right mechanics. And that's an important message. Now, the good thing these days is you can also simulate those to some extent. So if you have a direct drive motor or motor with a fairly low gear ratio, as we have, interestingly, we can simulate muscle-like properties in software with these motors. So some of our snake-like robots, they have a bit of passive compliance, so mechanical compliance, like a bit of to take impacts and things like that. But then we really simulate muscle-like properties in the control loops with current control in our motors. And that's interesting because then you mechanically it's much easier to design. It just remains a high-end motor, and you do current control and you can simulate a bit co-contraction of muscles, damping of muscles, and basically have a fairly simple mechanical design and still have interesting body dynamics, basically.
So I'm curious to ask you in that process, I don't know if you have any kind of design failed, or maybe benefits performance you never expected was counterintuitive, or why is this happen, or fail? I don't know the both spectrum here. Yeah.
Well, we have many failures, many, especially in water. So many water leakages and everything. So maybe I should say a few words, by the way, on the type of robots we develop, because maybe people don't know. So we have a whole spectrum of different types of amphibious robots that we design. So lamprey-like swimmers or eel-like swimmers that are like elongated robots that can swim and also crawl on ground like snakes. We have quite a few salamander-like robots with both limbs and legs. And here I think it's very interesting from a scientific point of view because salamanders are key animals from the evolution from swimming to walking. So studying them is super important to understand all vertebrate locomotion. And it's also interesting as an amphibious prototype for search and rescue. And then we also use quadruped robots that we developed. We had a cheetah cub, as we called it. Nowadays we have A1 robot, quadruped robot, we are lucky that Sangbei Kim gave us a mini cheetah robot. And we also worked a bit with humanoid robots, but there we do more things in simulation. So I would say the failures we had is mainly with our swimming robots taking water and braking a bit. So and interestingly, normally the even numbers of generations are not as good as the odd numbers. So generation 1 and generation 3 are better than generation 2 and generation 4 for some reason. So we start something, we have a good intuition, it works, then we want to improve it and we're disappointed. Then we improve it again, it gets better. So we go a bit by zigzag, up and down a bit.
Interesting, yeah. So because to ask you in that case, do you believe that design process? Because I think that now we speak about good design, for example, in soft robotics and how we can use digital computation with morphological computation. But for you, do you think you have to go for intuition firstly before going to come up with design? Maybe in Inspire, maybe beyond what we have in evolution. How do you see this process for coming up with the right design after maybe trial and error? Do you think intuition is so important in the first step, or you have to go for, for example, co-design process?
That's it's a good question. So most of our robots are still designed mainly for scientific purposes. So there we a big thing we have to do is a bit dynamic scaling. So the fact that we want to understand salamander locomotion, swimming and walking, but except for the enormous salamander, the giant salamanders in China and Japan, all salamanders are quite small. So like 20 centimeters or so, or even smaller. So at that scale, it's very hard to make an amphibious robot with enough degrees of freedom with small motors. So the first challenge we have is just scaling up to a type of motor which is good enough in terms of torque output and small enough for that torque output, and at a reasonable price. And basically that then determines the whole dimension of our robot. So we use a lot of dynamic cell robot motors, and therefore our robots are typically 10 times larger than the real animal. So that's the first constraint, is we start from the good motor that's kind of has a good torque output, and then we scale up our models. And then we do dynamic scaling of the motions we want to do, like we have to scale down frequencies and things like that to have the same dynamics, like fluid dynamics, for instance. So that's part of the design process, is choosing the right motors and then having the kinematics and then a weight distribution that more or less matches the one of the animal. So that's when we have a bit of scientific question. And here there are some cool things to do in biology, like we have access to CT scans of bones, so you can have good knowledge of the bones. There are even we use X-ray videos of motion of animals, so then you really have the perfect kinematics of the animal. And there in the design process, for instance, for Plurobot, one of our salamander robots that's closest to the real salamander, we did an optimization process where we were optimizing the kinematics of our robot to find the best place where to place the joints in the spine to best match the undulations for swimming and walking. So there was a bit an optimization process happening during the design phase before we went to the hardware. So that's for Plurobot. And maybe a little parenthesis, one very cool project we had is make a fossil robot. So that's the Orobot project, where we did the same type of things, but based on a CT scan of a fossil of an extinct animal. That was super cool for a super exciting project. We were lucky to get into Nature and even make the cover. But based on the same design process we had used for Plurobot, we designed a very good copy or fairly good copy of this fossil Orobates and make a Orobot robot. So that was a cool design process.
Interesting, yeah. So I'm curious to ask you about the learning process, since we speak about in robotics, how, or soft robotics as well, how they can adapt to uncertainty, like damage, whatever. Do you think in that case, how the body and the brain should adapt to uncertainty? From your design, how you imagine a scenario like that? Be redundant as well.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because we were lucky to just have a paper in Science Robotics that addresses exactly that topic, and in swimming. Because interestingly, even in the field of neuroscience, there's still a bit of debate how locomotion is generated and controlled between both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And as you know, the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is all the nerves going to the muscles, but also all the sensory feedback signals coming through dorsal roots through the spinal cord. And for even 100 years ago, there has been a debate: should we see locomotion in vertebrates as a more central-driven mechanism, where the central nervous system creates oscillations, sends them to the body, and then gets feedback, so more like a bit feed-forward control? Or should we see locomotion as a more sensory-driven principle, where the peripheral nervous system is in charge, and more you should see locomotion as almost a chain of reflexes? You initiate a movement, you get into some sensory state, you get that back, and then like a pendulum, through sensory signals, you generate rhythms. And it has been a big debate between, for instance, Sherrington, a famous neuroscientist, and Brown, who won. They had a bit, not a fight, but they had different propositions. And interestingly, we still don't know exactly this beauty, how this integration of the central pattern generators, for instance, oscillators that can generate rhythms in the spinal cord, and the sensory feedback together generate locomotion in vertebrate animals. Interestingly, because people could isolate spinal cords and generate rhythms in isolate spinal cord, like in the lamprey, you can generate beautiful rhythms without any feedback, just out the neural networks. Most people these days were thinking it's mainly a central thing, like a feed-forward thing. But we kind of underestimated the role of the sensory feedback as well. So to answer your question, we made a recent study where we could simulate all these components, the rhythm generating circuits, different types of feedback loops from, let's say, for instance, pressure sensors. And in animals, this leads to beautiful redundancy. We could show that exactly the same type of swimming patterns, you could either generate them by purely the network of oscillators, so a central mechanism, or by feedback loops, and have it a sensory-driven mechanism. And both coexist, we believe both coexist in the animal. And we could show that indeed, if you have this coexistence, you become super robust against lesions. You can destroy sensors, you can remove couplings between different parts of the spinal cord controllers, and the robot will still keep swimming. So incredibly robust. Interestingly, like eels, in fact, if you take an eel, you can cut the spinal cord in two parts, it will still swim almost as intact as before. So incredible robustness thanks to this combination, we believe, of central and peripheral mechanism. So I find this exciting because the robot allowed us for the first time to work with neuroscientists to systematically explore different combinations, something that's very hard to do on the real animal. And at the same time, at the end, we have a robot controller that's incredibly robust, that's a bit self-organized, and if you were to implement it in a distributed fashion, would be very hard to break, basically, because of this very nice fault tolerance that's shown by the spinal cord. So that may be one answer to your question, is at least we are very excited to study this combination of feed-forward feedback control, central and peripheral mechanism in animals. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thanks for sharing these points. Yeah. So since we close the end, I have a few questions. Maybe the first one, what are maybe other directions you think in robotics field could be very interesting? For example, you mentioned feedback, and there's some topics about should we less rely on the feedback and be more predictive in the behavior. Do you think that something would be possible to reduce the computation and something like that? And also what other topics do you think technological roadblocks or maybe something is really, really maybe challenging for robotics to be, studied more, understanding more,
Well, I think this notion of mixing very robust, reactive, ultra-fast control and mixing longer-term planning, optimization, and learning, I think that's still a bit a challenge in robotics. Clearly, the whole field of optimal control and reinforcement learning is doing super well, and impressively well, I have to say. But still, sometimes the timescales are too short, too long to do very reactive behavior, and sometimes it's hard to plan in advance a long time horizon because maybe the perception and the model of the environment is not good enough. So, interestingly, I think that's still a challenge in robotics. And for me, very interestingly, this is still completely not understood in animals. I think I just started a project which is exactly in that goal. Is many people in neuroscience do not either the people in neuroscience are working on the motor cortex and the cerebellum, so they do learning and planning, but they forget that there is a spinal cord in the loop, and that any planning that happens in the motor cortex is not in muscle space, but it's in spinal cord input space. So there's an enormous reduction of bandwidth. Our brain doesn't think in terms of muscles or muscle fibers. We really think more that would be too high dimensional for our brain. We really send lower dimensional signals to the spinal cord circuits, which then are in charge of creating movements. And so let's say people working on motor cortex and learning, they forget about all the functionality of the spinal cord. And vice versa, people in the spinal cord, they forget, the spinal cord can do so many amazing things, they forget a bit that you still need the high part of your brain for planning movements, for visually guided behavior and everything. And they forget a bit about all these nice inputs that the high part of the brain sends to the spinal cord. But interestingly, in biology, therefore, there's this notion of discovering how you can do learning and planning while taking into account all the dynamics offered and the control loops offered by the spinal cord. That's still not properly solved. And it's exactly the same problem as I mentioned before in robotics. Mixing very reactive behavior from the spinal cord while you mix more anticipation and learning based on higher parts of the brain. And this I found a very exciting field of study in between robotics and neuroscience, because you need to think about topics in both cases, like internal models. How do you learn the dynamics? How do you learn inverse models of your dynamics? How do you learn inverse models of your spinal cord dynamics? So learning how inputs to outputs work with the spinal cord. And these are exciting topics where I hope and I feel taking inspiration from animals can maybe push a bit the robustness of optimal control, for instance, or reinforcement learning in robotics.
So a few questions left. The first one, how do you deal with doubt when you have new ideas with your team? I don't know, do you deal with doubt in the process of creation, different design, will work, not? I don't know if you have doubt sometimes.
Doubt? Oh yes, all the time. Yeah, that's an interesting point. No, we often doubt. But I'm lucky to have a very exciting team that we just explore as well. I think that's a cool thing of being in academia and in robotics in particular. It's just there's so many venues to explore, and of course you have failure, but there are many cool things to explore, especially if you use simulations in the loop, so that you don't lose too much time developing a bad robot or a bad morphology. They're super cool things to explore, and you learn from failure. So things sometimes don't work, but that's still a good lesson. So you still win something from failure.
Great. And what could be the most important quality for you as a researcher? Is something you should have to keep always?
I would say excitement and originality. Try to do new things, explore new things, new behavior, new robots, new questions. I always recommend that to my PhD students, and then you always can create a PhD thesis if you have addressed something that nobody else has addressed. Even if you don't succeed in answering question or maybe solving the problem, you will still have an interesting story to tell. So I would say explore new things and be excited in doing that. And also I would say we are really blessed in academia. We are lucky people. We have a salary to do, we paid a salary to explore cool things. So we should really be grateful for that. So that gives me a lot of energy, by the way, that we are so lucky to work in an exciting field. Even things are not perfect. We compared to the rest of the world, we really live a golden life. So we should be grateful for that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Maybe a quick question here about originality in ideas. Do you think maybe sometimes it's scary for you if you go for something completely outside the mainstream? I don't know. Do you think that something could be scary a little bit in academia? If you go completely ahead of the trend won't be the mainstream?
Yeah, that's of course that's a problem. Or what could be problematic sometimes is you could be lonely. So I guess people who were really pioneers much in advance of other people who nobody believed in them, they explored things that seemed crazy at the time and at the end became something. So I guess you can be lonely there if you do that, and it can be scary because you're really in the dark. You don't know where you're going. So that can be maybe a problem. Maybe the thing I often also recommend my PhD students to do is mix a bit risky and less risky things. So things that are a bit more blue sky, a bit more crazy, together with the things that are a bit less, more like low hanging fruit, more reasonable. So mixing that, you always have something to fall back to in case of your crazy ideas are too crazy, let's say.
Good one. Yeah. Lastly, I don't know what advice was given to you and was life changing. And stick to your mind, maybe.
I got many good advice. Well, maybe one I got, but it's kind of specific to the field of biorobotics. It's important to know why you do things and have a target audience, because I would say the field of biorobotics has a bit suffered from being a bit exotic field where people were doing cool things, a bit toys like crawling robots or things that are moving in a fun way and that are doing things, but people then wonder what's the usefulness, and let's say it's a robot that doesn't do something better than a traditional robot, and that doesn't really contribute to an understanding of biology because it's a bit not rigorously done enough. So I always recommend when people do biorobotics, and people recommended that before me as well, is make clear, first of all, is what you do, is it a scientific purpose? Is the do you address a scientific question and you want to convince biologists? And then it's a specific type of paper and study you have to do. You have to be very rigorous in your hypothesis, in your experimental setup to test your hypothesis. And there's great work happening in biorobotics to have really a scientific goal, and that's wonderful. Or your goal should be engineering, you solve a problem, but then you should have quantitative matrix to say if you do it better or not than others. You should compare to others, and it's fine to explore a bit for some time and maybe have lower performance than others just to explore. But at some point, the goal would then still be to have better performance and or at least quantify it. Because I have seen a few projects that are a bit in between, that explore a bit some scientific questions, do a bit of engineering, but don't do it rigorously sufficiently on both sides. And then at the end, that's a bit a lost opportunity and gives a bad reputation possibly to the field, because it's people say, okay, cool, but so what? and then I had an impression, I think now it has changed, but at some point the field of biorobotics or bio-inspired robotics was a bit viewed negatively because of that. But I think since now people do really good science or good engineering, so I think it is now going back up and has a very good reputation. But it's more a recommendation, is be careful, do things in a rigorous way, either as an engineer or as a scientist.
That's really, really excellent advice. I can't agree more with that. Words would like to say for robotics community? You would like to say?
No, but well, let's enjoy life. And as mentioned, I think we are lucky to do what we do. For me, I'm feeling blessed to do robotics. So it's such an exciting field, so interdisciplinary, touching so many questions and so many problems. We are really lucky. And also, we need collaborations. That may be my final word. Is if people want to collaborate with me, please write to me. Many cool things happen by having some beers with people and then crazy ideas. That's how we got this paleontology robotics project. Robotics is really the field of collaboration and friendship and collaboration. So that's also very important. So let's collaborate and have fun together.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Professor Schwartz. Honor to have you, and I really enjoyed listening to you. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Great. Yeah. Thanks a lot for having me.